In the last segment that we heard, the marvellous paper that we've just listened to, in one section of the paper, reference was made to Japaljarri Spencer's painting The Snake Bite. And in discussing that, Craig talked about this issue of the soul being called upon as a means of salvation. I think this is an important theme that is now going to carry through into this next session that Pamela Nathan will present to us. And I think the other thing that is a very important underpinning concept was the concept that you, Melinda, referred to of country and the importance of country, which I think will be an underpinning theme throughout the day and an important one. So having just made that linkage between the last session and this one, it's really now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Pamela Nathan. As you know from the flyer, Pamela is a clinical and forensic psychologist and also a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. Pertinent today, though, is the fact that she's had close to 40 years' experience working with indigenous people. So she brings a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of understanding from that experience. In the last 10 years, she has been working with Cassie, creating a safe, secure environment is the fuller expression of that acronym. And during that time, and there are some publications, I believe, on the readings table as well, she's helped to bring some remarkable and I think some very innovative psychoanalytically based programs into Central Australia that have been very successful. I just wanted to say from a personal perspective that having witnessed her in action in Central Australia, it was very clear to me the esteem with which she's held by the people in those communities. So it's a really a great privilege to introduce Pamela Nathan. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for all being here. It's a great opportunity to be able to talk about the work. Okay. Thanks. So I write this paper as a white fella. I'm privileged to have had the friendship and mentoring of Kumanjay Liklaitna Jabananga and Kumanjay Husan, their friendship and mentoring, and it is this in memory which provides momentum to the work. In this paper, I draw on the work of creating a safe, supportive environment, Cassie, a not-for-profit Aboriginal organisation using a psychoanalytic perspective, working with trauma and youth in the Northern Territory. This organisation was generously funded by the Dara Foundation for 6 years, and Vayalan Cantor, a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, was instrumental in its foundation and working alongside. So let me take you to the heart of Australia, to the town of Alice Springs and Buntua, the traditional lands of the Central Aranda people. Many of you have been taken there in recent months with blistering headlines, megaphoning crisis, destruction, anarchy, and calls for the police and military to reinstate order and punish. There is said to be a youth crisis, a rampaging, relentless, recidivist crime, which is taking centre stage in the town discourse. Condemnation, rage, suspiciousness, and helplessness ricochets and is reified into a binary position of us and them. The Aboriginal youth have reclaimed their town at night, where currently many dare not tread, save for the police on night patrols. The shops in the town are mostly barricaded with aluminium shop fronts. One might say the town of Alice Springs and Buntua is in breakdown. The surrounding McDonald Ranges encloses a cauldron of splits and identifications with seemingly dangerous objects, apparently fueling crime occurring in marauding groups where excitement and omnipotence may predominate, and the exploding shrapnel of unarticulated projections can find fitting targets for repressed hatred and rage. There is denial of the awful truth of the internal and the external worlds by many that heralds a loveless life filled with badness and tyranny. As Symington states, there is then within a tyrant and a frightened child. There is indeed a crisis, but what is the nature of it? The truth is the youth, including children in this category, have endured assaults and violations in their external worlds as heirs to the brutalities of colonisation. The truth is the youth have endured assaults and violations to their internal worlds and potential authenticity. The youth have lived with soul murder. The term soul murder was first coined by the playwright Henrik Ibsen. He defined it as the destruction of the love of life in another human being. Psychoanalyst Leonard Shengold wrote a book called Soul Murder, wherein arbitrary edicts or a chronic lack of empathy cause a child to lose vitality, confidence, and joy. Soul murder, found in the traumatized, Paul Williams said recently, is achieved by attacking the uniqueness and integrity of the child. A key legacy of colonisation is transgenerational trauma, where a population has been exposed to invasion, massacre, dispossession, force, intrusion, interference, impingement, and the assimilation of uniqueness in their external worlds, thereby sustaining violating attacks on the core of their cultural world, it is not far-fetched to assume, nor exaggerated to claim, that the generations have internally endured lacerating violations to their internal core selves collectivities. This is soul murder, the trauma that the youth have inherited. They've been robbed of their dreaming and their core authenticity stolen. Colonisation has catastrophically impacted on Aboriginal people who have suffered violations to their law, culture, way of life, and therefore to their core being, minds, hearts, and self. Australia has mostly been a criminal and dead mother country, referencing Andre Green, to the Aboriginal population. It has been largely a country of soul murder and not a country of soul making. Donna Winnicott wrote of a state of inward being that requires the utmost privacy and respect. Intrusions into this most intimate of places can result in a violent destruction of personality. The result can be a total catastrophe. Ultimately, the experience of disrespect, Honus, cited in Melinda Hingson's book, says, poses a risk of an injury that can cause the identity of the entire person to collapse. Paul Williams, in his book, The Authority of Tenderness, refers to the predatory invasion of minds, and in speaking of psychological death and profound isolation, refers to torturers as soul murderers who rely on exposure of the core self. I'll begin with brief fragments of some traumatic encounters I experienced with the youth in Central Australia over the last few years, conveying something of the disturbance and suffering found in their violated states of mind: starvation, assault, silent smashing, hiding, despair, and annihilation. I've altered relationships and other details. Hunger. I sat at the far table on a leather seat of the hotel restaurant alone. An Indian meal was placed on the table. Suddenly, a black arm extended toward my plate, grabbing a piece of the naan bread. I really jumped. His youthful body slid close to me on the seat. I looked at him. His face was very close to mine. I have never in my life seen such hungry eyes. They bore into me, glazed from alcohol perhaps, but hungry, so hungry. I wrapped the food into the naan and put it onto a small plate and said, Warlpiri kala kala. I was urging him to leave quietly and to modify his isolation by communicating my Aboriginal affiliations. At the same time, I was also mindful of his gross social exclusion. His presence had silenced the room. All stared in a seeming dread. The hotel staff were flurried. Despite my efforts, it ended regrettably with the police taking him home, but at least not to the cells. Assault 1. Hours before I'd been in the hospital, there were 2 girls injured having been punished by customary law. We were taking them home. Their families were leaving town to avoid further trouble. Their girlfriend was killed by a white man, a hit and run. I felt a sharp sadness and I said to the girl outside, "You must be so sad you can't go to your friend's funeral." She started to cry. Some are saying I pushed her into the car, that I killed her. I said, "But a white fella killed her. He did the hit and run, not you. You must feel so afraid." She nodded and cried again. The hit and run white fella was deleted from culpability, the crime of killing, and the Aboriginal girl had internalized the badness, a sequelae of transgenerational trauma. Assault 2. An Aboriginal girl was pleading guilty for assaulting a non-Aboriginal woman in a car park. The lawyer said in her defence that there was, quote, "no rational explanation for the assault." The magistrate suddenly lashed out in fury. "No rational explanation. You took offence. You poked, you spat, you stared, you failed. You have no idea what a civilised society is. You have no idea how to behave in a civilised fashion. This is a serious offence." She remained silent, and it took all my restraint not to shout, "Stop assaulting her humanity." Silent smashing. 2 youths smashed the windows of some government offices and broke in, but were quickly apprehended. One youth injured his head and face on the broken glass, a sort of defacing, and received treatment and bandages at the hospital. I met one of the youths in the detention centre and one who was living with his mother in a town camp. He stood silently as his mother talked in an outpouring of rage and grief. It emerged that the 2 youth had visited the morgue 2 days before the offence, where they found their auntie dead and defaced. I was shocked to discover the woman was so closely related and therefore glimpsed the proximity of their pain, and was dismayed, along with their mother, that no apparent understanding of their internally smashed worlds was named or dispensation granted by the justice authorities. Hiding. A 12-year-old youth hid on the bus run from school in the morning in a remote town. I saw him run from the bus and urgently tug some bushes to cover himself on the edge of the main road. When I approached, he tried to hide from me. I told him I was attending a land council meeting up the road so he could locate me. He stared at my Aboriginal bracelet. I asked him if he was hiding from school, and he whispered yes. He told me he was hiding because he didn't want to go to school because, to quote, he got bullied by the white fella kids. He then volunteered he had trouble learning. I commented it was hard because his lessons were in English but not in his language. He nodded, that one too. He said he was going to, quote, "run all day by himself and then sneak home." I asked if he got lonely by himself all day, and he nodded and agreed. I could not persuade him to come out of hiding, but he did not want to stop talking. Despair. Another youth waved me down. He could see the Aboriginal logo on the vehicle and asked me for a lift home to his town camp. And then he asked for the water he saw in the vehicle. He told me he'd been asked to leave by the security guard at a youth program for giving cheek. He said he'd been walking all night, up all night. "I'm so tired." He then said, "I'm so fed up. Finishing the water, he immediately fell asleep in the vehicle as we got to the perimeter of the camp. He looked small and young. He told me he was in upper primary school. He sounded like a weary, despairing old man. Killed. J. Walker, you may or may not know, but has been mentioned this morning and in the national press, was a young Warlpiri man in the justice system who was fatally shot 3 times inside his house with his grandfather and family at Yindamu in 2019. The emergency response team had been called in. At the time of the 2nd and 3rd shots, the contested evidence says the 2 officers had control of him. Kieran Finane, a journalist, reported, "He was face down on the ground, incapable of stabbing anyone, with an officer on top of him and with his arm pinned under him, jammed up under a mattress." According to the body-worn video, Bulleted Kumanjay Walker could be heard softly crying, almost whimpering. Kumanjay did not want to return to detention. He breached his order for a minor crime by returning home on country and breaking his anklet monitor. A few days later, I met a youth, his friend, who was next door at the time and had heard the shots, and his uncle, who was in Indonesia for the family funeral. His shattered friend, usually lively and chatty, was mute and had been for a few days, and his stoic uncle, his grief dignified, was minding him. His uncle muttered to me that his nephew had witnessed the dragging of the shot body, the dragging which was an act of dehumanized callousness. So, colonization and stolen lives. The land, as Raleigh said, was settled either at the point of a gun or at the knowledge of what a gun could do. Much has been written about the history of invasion and much is now known. The past is replete with the theme of murder, criminality, racism, violence, violations, and stealing, or the potential for it. I think much of what Aboriginal people have lived with, however, has remained unknown. I don't have the time here to tell some of the stories of the old people who have died from the 1980s, but have them in this written paper. Suffice to say, whilst fighting for their way of life, Aboriginal people have been robbed of their lives, lands and resources, their old-time way of life, their law and cultural connections, the children of the stolen generation, their languages, their souls and sources of living. In the name of civilization, obscuring whitefellow greed and religious, state and defence interests. In saying this, it is important to note that Aboriginal people have stood strong, survived, and lived with extraordinary resilience. The past has a living presence. Robin Jabanunga Granites at the commencement of the coronial inquest for Kumanjay Walker in 2022 said, "The ways our lives have been impacted is unimaginable. You cannot begin to understand how deeply his loss sits on our bodies, how it tears our spirits apart, and how it will stay in our country for generations to come. The pain we feel is real, and the past has led us here." These evocative words are redolent of the hurting hearts of many Aboriginal people who have shared their stories with Cassie. The contentious opinion of John Sylvester, a journalist on the fatal shooting of Kumanjay Walker, perhaps offers a kind of denouement. Kumanjay Walker, an Aboriginal youth from Indonesia, Central Australia, was the victim of 1,000 injustices and more than 200 years of cultural oppression. Zach Rolfe, the policeman, had to deal with the consequences in a little over 3 seconds. We loaded the gun, he just pulled the trigger. Referencing Williams in the following, one can say that the cruel colonial era catalysed lacerating legacies that have invaded the true self, kin and culture, dismembering into half-caste parts the whole which has been damaged and outlawed, and where the dignity of core selves has been disrespected. The authentic self was not protected and the needs and rights were flagrantly disregarded. The growth of the inner world was vitiated at continual risk of exposure and injury. The impact of interference with the authentic self gives rise to a dread of human contact, leading to radical isolation, where the mind and personality are caged and subjugated. Winnicott says, "Rape and being eaten by cannibals, these are mere bagatelles as compared with the violation of the self's core, the alteration of the self-central element." The youth. Of the children and young people in detention in the Northern Territory, 99% are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. One youth in the justice system we now know was shot. Our Cassie assessments show most have undiagnosed depression and anxiety. These youth are psychologically distressed. They tell us they offend, to quote, because they feel scared, stressed, angry, insecure, unsafe and uncared for, bored or feel nothing at all. And some offend just because they're hungry. Yes, they are perpetrators, but they're victims too. They tell us, to quote, they grow up with grog, gambling, hunger, humbug, fights, brothers and fathers doing jail time, or dead too soon. They tell us they feel, to quote, shame, miserable, no respect, guilty and bad, for hurting their communities, sad and a little bit worried. Many of these youth have had parents who are stolen generation, have been placed in child protection and/or institutional foster care. These youth cycle through the courts on a regular basis, and detention, which is based on a paradigm of punishment, augmented with rehabilitation, has become a perverse rite of passage, which can lead to adult criminality. The main offences committed by the youth are property offences, theft, home and commercial break-ins, vehicle thefts, driving unlicensed, damage to property and substance usage, not offences of assault, homicide or sexual deviancy. In addition, the youth often offend in groups from the marginalised town camps, and the younger ones may be called upon to assist as partners in crime. In short, the youth primarily steal and damage property, while their forebears endured manifold thefts and damage, and the youth are known to throw rocks, and their forebears were assaulted and massacred with bullets. One might say that their delinquent acts are not mindless, but unconsciously and consciously driven by the past criminality of the white man. I mention diagnosis now, not that I think it's particularly useful, but it may serve to contain the damnation in the narratives on the delinquent youths, and the suite of potential diagnoses may be testimony to far-ranging distress. Offending Aboriginal youth may attract a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, but not at the severe end, and/or PTSD, attention deficit disorder, borderline personality disorder, fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, depression and anxiety. I believe most Aboriginal youth offenders do not meet the formal criteria of severe psychopathy. In my experience of working with severe psychopathic mainstream offenders, mostly only those who have committed the heinous crime of murder meet the criteria. In Central Australia, despair and not murderousness is central to the countertransference and to the etiology of youth offending, albeit past murderousness ghosts the landscape. The youth, like their elders, some psychoanalytic understandings, the youth, like their elders, have had to bear the unbearable, and their authentic cultural selves have been exposed to unthinkable anxiety. Craig San Roque cites Russell Goldflam, an Alice Springs barrister, who describes a legacy of anime coined by the sociologist Durkheim, which is from the Greek for no law, the Aranda Turinga Arangwa, which is to live in despair without hope, because in that state there is confrontation of the existential horror of chaos staring you in the face. Goldflam describes the fate of despair for the youth, mirrored by all in the justice system. Watson, a cultural boss from another state, elucidates, a lot of young people live in another culture. It's not mainstream, it's not traditional, they're lost in the wind. Here the creation of the abject, a non-person, is heralded, invoking an inherently traumatic experience, where Perlberg says an object is violently cast out of the cultural world, having once been a subject. Julie Kristeva, cited by Perlberg, has suggested that the abject is a place where meaning collapses. The social pain is real and radioactive, in the words of Gamble, and contact with the criminal justice system is manifest in the manifold inequities experienced by Aboriginal youth. Using a psychoanalytic lens, the impact of transgenerational trauma features in the here and now with the there and then. Vulcan's concept of the reactivation of a chosen trauma, a collective trauma, referring to the shared mental image of a very traumatic event in a large group's ancestors' history, is the quintessential mega-theoretical construct germane to youth offending in Central Australia. Related, Schneider describes how the traumatic situation can variously impact, with an overwhelming too much, where the representational world is violently destroyed, or is preceded by a too little, an absent resonant object, and an ensuing nameless void. The agent of terror in trauma is monstrosity, the monstrous internal object. Bringing a psychoanalytic mindset to the inner crime scene of Aboriginal offenders, Dr. Timothy Keogh provides key understandings enriched by Symington and Hyatt Williams. He highlights the reverberations of psychic pain, of unbearable loss, and traumatic rejection that cannot be tolerated, the need to kill off whatever is too painful, leading to an abandoned object and a seeking of punishment for criminality and repeated recidivism, obscuring need, cries for help, and quests for hope under the guise of ruthlessness and despair. It's important to underline that Glaser, in describing the core complex at the separation individuation stage, states this is grossly illustrated in the stereotype of the institutionally reared child due to trauma, neglect, and deprivation, with the attendant fears of abandonment. Going farther afield theoretically now, one might speculate that there is a confluence with the not got in the external world with the negative reality of the internal world. I think Ogden's conceptualization of the negative, referring to a quality of being alive in the realness of what is not there, namely the absence, the gap, the amnesia, the deprivation pervading the entire personality, is of the utmost importance. Quoting Ogden here, the gap, the death, the nothing is what feels real and alive, I think, to the youth offender and forms a potentiate to crime. Ogden has described Winnicott's work on the moment of anger, I add cumulative moments, in relation to maternal caretaker absence, where the loss may be addressed and mitigated. However, if the anger is not expressed, it will always carry the potential and the fear of violence. Ogden says the object of the feared violence is not the dead mother, but the child person. When the anger is expressed and the negative is experienced, there can be a question that surfaces, and what will you do about it? And I think this question is fundamental to the criminal enactments by Indigenous youth in the justice system, and what will you do about it? Returning to psychopathy, Winnicott considered that the antisocial tendency can be manifest in the deprived youth child when deprived of essential features of home life, catalysing a lack of hope. The antisocial act is therefore, Winnicott says, an expression of hope, a desperate communication, and a defence against helplessness. He continues saying that the basis of the antisocial tendency is a good early experience that has been lost. Elaborating further, Winnicott says, there are always two trends evident in the antisocial tendency, which is stealing and destructiveness. He importantly notes that these two trends are in the first place object seeking and in the second destructive. The child who steals, he says, is not looking for the object stolen, but for the mother caretaker over whom he or she has rights, seeking a cure from the mother caretaker who unconsciously is believed to have caused the deprivation, in simple terms, feeling cheated. Klein, cited in Frank, spoke about the fear of annihilation, the death drive, that is the fear of uncontrollable, overwhelming, devouring objects, cruel internal figures where one's own destructiveness can become internalized and paramount. This takes on some resonance in lieu of Australia's murderous history. Australia has been mostly a depriving, bad mother country to these youth. So I now turn to the work of Cassie, which has attempted to facilitate the authenticity found and ground in cultural law on country. Over time, different programs were generated by the people. From the outset, Cassie's endorsed working alongside Aboriginal people and asking them how we can be helpful to them. The modus operandi of Cassie has been to facilitate and develop programs that are determined by Aboriginal people. They've primarily wanted to strengthen traditional cultural practices on their ancestral lands, on country, with the elders and Ngangkaris, the Aboriginal healing doctors, to heal. We've tried to facilitate programs that equalise power in the facilitation of wants and the co-creation and co-delivery of programs to facilitate genuine communication, local knowledge, and promote storytelling. Most importantly, Aboriginal people know we are on their side. Working in a community context necessarily shifts the focus from an intrapsychic world to an external socio-cultural world, albeit there is a dialectic relationship between both. Cassie privileges cultural experiences and differences and recognises the containing and creative possibilities they provide. Here, the notion of transitional or potential space, a term coined by Winnicott that refers to an intermediate area of experiencing, is relevant. It is in this space between the inner and outer world, which is also the space between people, that intimate relationships and creativity occur. Culture is essential for survival and a sense of belonging, having a place and an identity. The language of the soul is both emotional and cultural. Cassie also necessarily privileges the reality of race, racial divide and racial relations, recognising the powerful memories of people and the realities of inequality and power differentials that exist today. Cassie has not perceived Aboriginal people to be the problem, but considered, in the words of Stanner, how whitefellas might be a problem for Aboriginal people, and then considered what are the problems for Aboriginal people. The Cassie team over the years have tried to reflect throughout on how we can deconstruct colonialist ways of being and relating between ourselves and, in the work, where relevant, subject ourselves and our relations to scrutiny and to dialogue amongst ourselves with others and with Aboriginal people. So Cassie has, since 2019, been delivering an alternative for high-risk youth in detention in Central Australia and in the Shields for Living Tools for Life program. This program has been largely funded by the Northern Territory Government, initially as part of its Back on Track program. It's anchored in the flagship Men's Chalira movement, which Cassie facilitated for 4 years or more with philanthropic funding in the Western Desert in partnership with 5 communities with youth and elders. Despite cultural hegemony, this program at the time was unique and somewhat pioneering. Permission from police had to be sought, no government funding was available for such a program, and the men were in grateful disbelief that such a program could exist. The shift from Men's Chalira movement to the Shields for Living program was a focus on taking high-risk youth on country, and this was in response to the elders wanting their youth on country and not in custody. The Shields for Living program is a dual therapeutic and cultural program, the therapeutic being found in cultural traditions. The program has sought to facilitate and revive lost and remaining cultural connections. The youth are taught to make Chalira by the elders, which are traditional tools of hunting, ceremony, Aboriginal dreamtime and law that were confiscated under Western law as weapons. And these are number 7, boomerangs, spears, shields. Cassie's endeavoured to protect the wholeness and integrity of the cultural law and not forsake it. And this integrity is inviolate to the authentic self. As Martin Jugarai, who was in one of the earlier photos, a Ngangkari says about the Chalira, if we do not have these, we have no language, no culture. We have nothing. We are nothing. It's our history. It's a part of us. So the youth are taught by their elders in language who give their knowledge to make traditional tools, care for country, have conversations with the elders, tell sacred stories and talk about jail time and the problem life. The men and youth are encouraged to talk about their challenges of living in 2 worlds and about the trauma they've endured and acted out. As part of developing their narratives, the men discover old songlines and waterholes and are emotionally moved by the aliveness of their dreaming. Shifts in emotional states from the persecutory to the depressive position a la Klein can be evidenced. On the cultural camps, the making of the traditional shield is symbolic of the protective shield against persecutory anxiety, talking psychoanalytically, and the men are encouraged to make them. The youth know and I say, it's law way. The making of the spear and the throwing the spear may symbolise the throwing of potential possibilities in the potential space of country. Sorrow, lament, meaning, connection, and responsibility are embedded in the culturally sacred in memory of the grandfathers. As Martin Jugarai says, making Chalira is special. It is the spirit of the grandfather inside you. So it is a cultural healing program, acknowledging and working with the importance of relatedness, family and country. Referring to Fred Meyer's seminal work here, it's important to note that there is no self without kin. The identity of self is embedded in mutual relations with others and with the Jukurrpa and one's story derived from ownership and the narrative of named place, and with it are songlines and sacred objects, making it that's his story. Geographical location where events occurred punctuate any narrative, and sacred spaces and places entail stories and movements of ancestral beings, some of which you heard this morning. One's own country, Ngurawalcha, is a place of security and belonging. Being on country is about direct ancestral connections. The emotional world is inextricably linked to the Jukurrpa and to country. Lament can be heralded at times of ceremony or ritual. Celebration is evoked by being on country, holding country, and dancing on country. Kananinpa, namely holding, is a key cultural value in cultural healing. The land holds and links Walcha, Nguru, and Jukurrpa. I know how meaningful our programs are for the youth. I asked a young man we'll call Ezekiel from a remote community if he'd made a tool on the last camp. Grinning broadly, he said, yes, I made a boomerang for the first time. I asked him what he plans to do with it. Keep it, he said, keep it for ceremony business. Like all the youth Cassie works with, Ezekiel has a tool of value, something he made, a new skill, a good object, a symbol of strength, pride, protection, and in memory of the grandfather. The youth who tell us they feel happy, proud, safe, supported, and strong on our country camps. The youth say they like hitting it hard and they feel proud to take the tools back to community cultural way. The program is also now delivered weekly at the Youth Detention Centre in Alice Springs and to be transferred briefly to Dondale in Darwin while the detention centre is being upgraded. Cassie also has a site 1 kilometre out of Alice Springs at Desert Knowledge on a large bush block with a wheelchair and brings youth from town and town camps from day camps on country. The development of a permanent homeland site with accommodation offered by the Houston family at Albora, 500k from Alice Springs for longer term camps, is about to commence, which is a testimony to the wishes of the people and the success of the program. And the program is now funded by government. So I will now talk about and demonstrate the importance of using the psychoanalytic tool of the countertransference by the therapist as an authentic agent. Effective work in the context of such trauma and its consequences involves the deliberate use of oneself as an instrument of healing. Accordingly, the countertransference is one's living response to another's emotional state at any given moment, an empathic attunement to the person's experience of trauma and its sequelae. 9 predominant countertransferences became emergent in the Cassie work, albeit they are often experienced in a dynamic or entwined, and all pertain to the wounded psyche. I sort of call it the roller coaster. There is depression, rage, helplessness, threat and danger, humiliation, shame, guilt, isolation, insider, outsider, and howling grief. Having hope and hope being whacked is at the core of repeated mutilations. I use the notion of transference referenced by Ogden. Transference, Ogden says, is no longer simply the act of experiencing the analyst therapist as aspects of unconscious internal objects, but referring to Winnicott, Ogden refers to the patient's experience of the therapist as real or unreal, alive or dead, truthful or untruthful. Ogden employs the term paradox in the concept of the negative, where nothing is what feels real. Interestingly, the role of the therapist as an authentic agent, as understood by Pichon Riviere, is central to working with Aboriginal people and to good relations. Aboriginal people come to know Cassie can bear their stories, good and bad, that our attitude is one of scrupulous storehousing, and know we attempt to deeply listen, take responsibility for them, understanding their anxieties of loss and their fears of annihilation. They know Cassie hears their stories, which have a temporal dimension, and respond to them with spontaneous real receptivity and interpretations if needed, in the here and now with me. The role, as Pichon Riviere says, is becoming part of the interpretation vector and therefore part of transformational change, ahead and somewhere else. Communicating authentically, William says, requires exposure of oneself to comparable forms experienced by Aboriginal people, of unexpected grief, helplessness, confusion and dismay, and bodily symptoms like nausea, fatigue, tearfulness, hostile agitation, or visceral abhorrence. Like, he says, the organs could howl. William says we are pulled into these states to the point of feeling overwhelmed, humbled, and powerless, whilst feeling greatly concerned. I'll now briefly illustrate part of an encounter attempting to work authentically with young people in the aftermath of the tragedy, using the countertransference, which explicates their experiences. I return to the tragic death of Common J. Walker. A few days after the shooting, I was sitting in a creek bed talking to the youth, friends of the deceased, in an adjoining Warlpiri community to Yindamu. I'd been encouraged to talk to them by the powers that be about their offending and their rampaging damage to the police station in the aftermath of the death. Outwardly, the youth appeared disconnected, distracted, and avoidant. The sense of a no connection and nothingness, the gap, the death, the nothing, in the countertransference felt paramount. I sat and waited. I began to feel a growing pressure to address the death of Common J. Walker. He had not been forgotten. Whilst I was being ignored, I knew my presence was palpable to them. I felt a growing sense of paradox about who could be deemed indeed violent, me representing the white fella from colonial days, or them, the Aboriginal youths who had damaged the police station. The sand was burning hot and the oppressive heat seemed to mirror the growing intensity of burning projected feelings in the transference of deadness, cloaking grief. The paradoxical fallacy begged to be addressed. How could I address their violence when a gunshot delivered by a white fella had fatally killed an Aboriginal youth known to them? I reintroduced myself as Nabarula to the new youth present, affirming a kinship relationship, being on their side, and presumably not having amnesia about the fatality. I told them I was sorry, so very sorry, and I stood up and shook all their hands, as is the Aboriginal custom when there's been a death. The youth seemed surprised. They began to settle, sit, and listen. The handshake was a recognition of grief, of mutual grief. An elder spoke to his sadness and then questioned the need for the use of the gun. A couple of youths echoed him. One youth said how angry he was about the killing. I spoke to the tragedy, to the death. I presented them with a paradox that confronted me. How could I talk about their violence without referencing the violence which led to the death of Common J? The truth demanded to be told, and this need felt salient in the countertransference. I told them I felt a burning shame and grief to be a white fella that day, which resonated with the youth, who eventually gave voice to the brutal death of their friend, the poor one, they chorused, thereby filling a gap and abyss of intercultural relations of death itself. The transference of the dead, unreceptive, failing mother country demanded to be articulated. Interestingly, the youth then associated to the Coniston massacre. The massacre occurred in the late 1920s in the nearby country in response to the killing of a dingo hunter, and reports say about 200 Aboriginal people, the people of these youth, were murdered in a series of police expeditions. The Coniston massacre is in the living memory of Aboriginal people, and these youth remembered, and the first person to tell me about it was Kenny's father. They were communicating, they in the here and now were in touch with the murderous colonial past, the there and then stirred by the current shooting and après coup. I then spoke to the damage done to the police station and to their retaliatory violence. They spoke about how stressed, angry and mad they felt when they smashed it up. The elder volunteered the damage was not committed by youth alone. I spoke to their smashed feelings. The youth in turn spoke about how the police had left the community, handing out lollies, leaving them to feel bad. The police don't like Aboriginal people anymore. Here, I think, is an example of how the pain of the fatality could be suffered together, truthfully, and how in the face of recognition, honouring past violence and collective trauma, the youth were enabled to find their voice and talk to their feelings. I'll now very briefly expand on psychoanalytic thinking and experiencing, which has become emergent in the work of Cassie. In doing so, it's not my intention to eclipse what is intrinsic to the Jukurrpa. Winnicott says, to be alive is all. to work alongside Aboriginal people and their aliveness, honouring their wishes, needs and cultural foundations without interference or intrusion, but with acceptance, recognition, respect and trust, Cassie now believes is the key to preserving the sacred core. The psychoanalytic intent, in the words of Ogden, has become primarily ontological, having to do with being and becoming, and not just epistemological, having to do with knowing and understanding. The dreaming tracks of the Cassie psychoanalytic journey, one might say, have enabled us to experience and pinpoint, in the words of Winnicott, a primary source of real health, which is a feeling of real. Feeling real in the face of catastrophic psychic trauma heralds survival, thinking, emotional life, experiential abundance, space, and time. Referencing Ogden's recent and creative work, Winnicott says, the origin of feeling real arise, firstly from the experience of transitional phenomena in early life, where imaginative worlds are created, providing a royal road to cultural experience. Secondly, Winnicott builds somewhat paradoxically on the notion that the feeling of real arises from communication with the subjective or personal internal objects, which involves the core of the true self, which is a silent self, an isolate, permanently unknown and unfound. Winnicott says, to quote, "We have to recognize this aspect of health, the non-communicating central self, forever immune from the reality principle and forever silent. It is like the music of the spheres, absolutely personal. It belongs to being alive. And in health, it is out of this that communication naturally arises." The preservation of the individual as an isolate, Winnicott elaborates, is very important as it is part of the search for personal identity and for the establishment of a personal technique for communicating, which does not lead to a violation of the central self. Winnicott says, to quote, "At the centre of each person is an incommunicado element, and this is most sacred and worthy of preservation." Williams contrasts a healthy isolate with a radically isolated individual who has no one inside. There is nothing much there, or what is there is bad, like the youth may feel when alone, incarcerated. Isolation, Williams says, prevents change if the authentic self has been subjected to exposure, but when treated with respect, it may produce change or an alive personality. Traumatic experiences, Winnicott says, that lead to primitive defenses can belong to the threat to the isolated core, the threat of its being found, altered, and communicated with. Therefore, as therapists, Winnicott underlines, our most important responsibility is to recognize the power we possess to violate the person's sacred core by knowing too much and instead of waiting for the patient person to creatively discover. Winnicott speaks of the coexistence of two conflicting psychic trends, the need to communicate and the need not to be found. It is a sophisticated game, he says, of hide and seek, in which it is a joy to be hidden, but a disaster not to be found. A mitigating resolution to the contradictory need to communicate and the need to be incommunicado, Winnicott expands, is to share what belongs to the whole range of intermediate cultural experience. Ancestral lands are the place and space of awakenings of sacred selves. The feeling of real for the Pintupi people is equated from the Jukurrpa. It becomes real. In this space, the Shields for Living Tools for Life space, Aboriginal people do not have to manufacture false selves engaging in compliant object relating with white fellas. Instead, there can be real relationships and communications with human receptive companions. White fellas do not need to transgress this space with knowing, preconceptions, determinations, or expectations, but let the space be and let the beings become in silence, stillness, recognition, waiting, and movement, and facilitate the cultural experiences and inconceivable possibilities. When the individual can move freely through a generative spatial environment and select objects which potential is released, the true self will become emergent. Such realities cannot solely or in absolute be defined with words, figured out, nor fetishized, with outcomes or statistics. The outcomes are phenomenological. in the process of experiencing in and of itself, and is a bedrock of psychic growth. In the words of Margaret Kamara Turner, she said, "It is a touching way of how you feel for that person, which is the sacredness of that person to yourself and of yours to him. There's a big line in between that person and yourself, and it's a sacred thing. To keep it alive is one of the things we must do. We mustn't run over ourselves. We mustn't go across. We mustn't twist it around. To be who we are, you can't tangle up the lines." Wanda Williams says, like all authentic experiences, occurs when we are nothing other than who we are. In answer to the question, what do I have to be? There is a simple answer, you, and you can be found on country or in the country of the mind. Williams says authenticity is the birthplace of hope. By respecting the authentic self, cultural worlds, unique journeys of shared experiences, of shared wonder, and a combination of solitude and intimate partnerships can be realised. A thoughtful interest in the suffering of people can then be and are the conditions for the resumption of living. I now present a brief fragment of one of many encounters which demonstrates something of aliveness and of the finding of the true Yuan country. Ngangkari Jungarai story, How One Man Can Good. 7 at-risk youth were engaged for a day cultural camp, and they were taken to the town bush site for a reflective and tour-making meeting. A tour-making elder had prepared the fire, cooking the kangaroo tails, and was sitting calmly making a boomerang. On arrival, the youth watched and then began to rhythmically cut the wood in concert. A minor incident of aggression erupted between 2 participants, with a youth I called Jordan having delivered a kick. In vivo reflection followed and some high fives settled the I'm a street fighting man. The emergent trigger was the pending separation and the anticipation of loss between them. In the aftermath, I began to read the Janamaku book produced by the MPY Women's Council and the Pitjantjatjara elders, which is about a grandfather helping his troubled grandson, Janama, get back on track by teaching him the law. The youth wanted to see the photo of the contributors. I showed them and started to read. None of the youth appeared to be paying much attention, but I was being watched with some vigilance. Another youth I called Aaron, caught for stealing cash and cars, came and sat by my side and began to read with me in a soft, tentative voice. It was very touching, and I was surprised by his proximity and spontaneous participation. All the youth edged closer, including Jordan. The most distracted youth pulled his T-shirt over his face, seemingly unseen, but sat still for the duration. At the end of the reading, Aaron asked to see the photo again, and then he pointed to Kumanjay Hussein, saying, "Here's my Jamu." "Your grandfather." "Yes," he said with pride. "So I said he can be of help with stories and making shalira and help you stay out of trouble." "Oh," he said, and he nodded very seriously. The youth crowded around to see the photo again, all of them, and began to point to their Jamus, which they did not do at the outset. The words of the book created resonant lived experiences for the youth. They are in touch with the spirit of their grandfathers, which they could now share, their authentic origins and relations, the hopefulness in the story, and the resolution of the incident and being settled on country. In conclusion, I conclude with the voices of 3 Aboriginal people who make a plea for soul making for their youth and for Kumanjay Walker in memory going forward. It's only proper to end with the plea of Kumanjay Hussein, Cassie's past cultural consultant, who died too soon, who made an impassioned plea and an affirmation of the source of authenticity, saying, "We need to take the young people out on country while the old people are still around. We have got to do it now. We must take the young people out on country. We must get back to culture and teach them before the old people die. Make boomerangs, eat kangaroo with their elders who know the culture, know the stories, and know the songs. We need to stand together." Coming back to Robin Jabanunga Granitz at the coronial inquest for Kumanjay Walker, he said, "We are here to speak the truth. We do not want you to tell us what we need and what we feel. We will tell you what we want. For those of you attending the coronial inquest, did you know who Kumanjayi Walker was? Kumanjayi was a quiet young man who his family loved by his community, his people. But since the shooting, he's been blamed for his death. We need to dig deep to let Australia know how our young Warlpiri man lost his life. Coming back to Kumanjayi Walker's son, Samara Fernandan Brown, she said, "How do I want him remembered? As a person, you know, as a brother. He's a cousin, he's a brother, he's a grandson, he's a partner, he's a human. He's not the kind of thing you can read about and disconnect. He's a person. He is a human in people's lives." The coronial inquest reports that Kumanjayi Walker did not have a mental illness, but rather a cognitive impairment and suffered trauma. He nonetheless was incarcerated in a youth detention repeatedly and for long periods of time, including Dondale. He was settled, it was reported, when placed on Aboriginal programs such as Mount Theo, Kapu and Bushmob, and he was happiest at Yindamu with his girlfriend and family. He broke his ankle bracelet monitor on occasions, breaching orders to escape to Yindamu, which galvanised the justice system to search and detain. He wanted to stay on his country. Past and recent encounters indicated Kumanjayi Walker did not want to hurt anybody that fatal day. The essence of authenticity, cultural law, and connections on country are the inviolate homeland for the sacred of hope, wonder, humane dignity, concern, compassion, companionship, truth, aliveness, and feeling real. Rendering visible the landscape of the internal world, which I've understood may transform stigmatizing malignancies into psychic growth and save lives, from soul murder to soul making. And by truly knowing, in the words of Xavier Herbert, that white fellas have become residents of the land they originally called terra nullius by no other right than might, may transmute Australia into a land of the real and true sacred belonging. And then the youth may be found luminescent, settling on country, developing a living sense of imaginative selves, living in trust and not fear, nor anticipated fear. And very finally, I return to the end of the meeting with the youth at the remote community, giving them the last voice. Heralding the good in them, I mentioned the achievement of completing 2 camps. I asked what was good about the camps. Backflips and swimming, they chorused. I asked about the tools, since they'd not volunteered the making of them. Spears and shields, they proudly sang out. Suddenly enthusiastic and assuming agency, the youth wanted to show us the water on the mud flat. And when we got there, having enjoyed directing traffic, they played in the water and ran the flats. Water, of course, being a wellspring to life sources, green growth and tucker. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Really amazing paper. I think you'll all agree that Pamela's paper reflects a very deep appreciation and compassionate understanding of the psychic pain, particularly of young people. And I think all of this stems from your very broad experience in the field, but your compassion really shines through. So we've got about half an hour now for comments and questions, and I think we're meant to go over here.
I don't know, Kenny, you had any response?
Yeah, yeah. You might like to come first. Do you want to speak from there first?
Yeah. Now, I suppose in the nutshell is that, look, if we want sort of our members of society to conform to things, we've got to teach them. We can't assume that they'll understand all of this thing as if osmosis. You know, I'm a cultural educator. I educate fellow Aussies to go out to remote communities and do their job. But there's no no cultural orientation for our Aboriginal people coming into the mainstream. We're coming into a culture that we need to understand. So we need someone to teach us as well. So, let's not just assume because we get policies right and all of that, it's going to be understood. We've got to teach it. Otherwise, we're going to just miss the point all the time. Okay?
So if you'd like to join us, because you might have some comments when questions come up as well.
Not a problem.
If you want to come and join us here or
Yep,
stay there, whatever you like. Questions or comments from the audience? There's really quite a lot to digest. I mean, your paper very much focused on the difficulties of young people and the challenges of young people. But I thought it really showed, because of your psychoanalytic training, which usually implies a psychoanalytic experience yourself, a way thinking of the story, that how young people can come good. There's a question over here.
Thanks, Pam, for that truly inspiring talk. And it's great to hear you, to hear Craig. I'd just like to put a little, say something in that we're in the brain centre. We've got, there's a lot, our traditional approach is in the brain. What we've heard from both of you doesn't come from the brain at all. Right? And we're on a journey in this country. We don't know what the outcomes are going to be. We've got no control over outcomes. And to ask questions that expect people such as yourself to give outcomes is a bit of a misunderstanding of the journey we're on, I think. And when I've just come back from New Zealand, and I thought I'll try and find a greenstone in New Zealand, because in New Zealand, it's the only country in the world where they don't mine greenstone. They find it on the beaches and in the rivers, in stones. And I asked the receptionist at the hotel I was staying in, oh, there's some greenstone around here, I believe, on the West Coast. She said, the locals will tell you that you don't find the greenstone finds you. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Nicely captured there. Yeah.
Chris, if you don't mind, would you just let the people know, like, who you are? I know who you are, but say something about your work with Legal Aid in Central Australia, mate.
Thank you. Yes, Chris Loram is my name. I met Pam when I was working as a solicitor for the Central Australian Aboriginal Legal Aid Service in Alice Springs. I'm a lawyer by trade. I now work as a town planner in Port Fairy. I work for the Aboriginal Legal Service in Victoria, where I did my articles. Aboriginal culture was, of course, and still is a mystery. It was a huge mystery when I worked in Victoria. When I went to Central Australia, I learned where some of it was coming from. And I would just say that what you learn in working with Aboriginal people is that the main thing you're learning about is about yourself. You might learn little bits and pieces about Aboriginal culture along the way, which is always a blessing.
Chris is a very shy man. What he hasn't told you, he's a mongrel like a lot of us. He's the father of Dan Sultan, the singer. Proper mongrel.
And he has contributed to this debate on transgenerational trauma in a TED talk, which some of you may have seen, but I'd recommend that. And it's on YouTube. It's called, the topic of the talk is creativity and its cathartic impact on transgenerational trauma.
Creativity and its cathartic impact on transgenerational trauma.
You search that on YouTube and you've got his talk.
Yeah, that's what you'd search. Yeah, thank you for that. Other comments, questions? Melinda?
Just while other people are working out what their questions might be. Thanks very much, Pam. Very, very moving work. Many directions one could go, but I wanted to ask a question outside of the psychoanalytic, which, and it's great that Kenny's up there with you as well. What makes a good, strong organisation that can do this kind of work in the present? And I've partly got in mind a part of Craig's paper, of Craig's talk earlier, where he was talking about the Warlpiri Youth Development Aboriginal Corporation up to a certain time. Those of us who work in these places know how extraordinarily difficult it is to create authentic, strong, robust organisations. And I would just love to hear a little bit about that side of Cassie.
You happy to take that?
Yes, look, I think you've certainly made a very important point. I mean, the roller coaster journey, I mean, it's been a very big 12, 13 years with Cassie. And I think, I mean, Kenny had been on the board. We've had very strong Aboriginal leadership, and we've had very strong Aboriginal consultants. And I think, and I have to say, Anne Cantor, as philanthropist, she really had an immense capacity to contain and take risks. So Cassie wouldn't be where it is now without having been kicked off by the Dara Foundation, and she really stood by Cassie in an absolutely remarkable way with no expectations and took enormous risks. And so I think Cassie was very fortunate in that way. And then we've had really amazing Aboriginal leadership and, people working, Aboriginal communities have been, very much galvanised, to work alongside, or us to work alongside. And we've had great workers. And I did have some photos up, but I thought there were too many, so I've taken some of them down. But we've had some terrific people in Cassie, and communities have been, we've worked with a lot of communities now. We're mainly in the West. Originally, we started off with the Central Australian Aboriginal Congress, and I have to say, for the first couple of years, we didn't know what we were doing there, and trying to work out what to do together. And then actually Kenny came along, I'm just reminded, and he did some terrific work with the men, and the work started to sort of become, you can talk about if you like, but it cohered into a sort of project, and it was working with the men and finding about the men's shed. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but it has been a journey. And I just, before Kenny does, I think it'd be great if Kenny said something about the work. We now do have government support, and I do think, we were talking about this briefly last night, that there is now a new change in the federal government, and there's been great support in the Northern Territory. And whilst you might say things structurally have not changed necessarily, for organisations like Cassie, it's been made an enormous difference, and relationships are different, and funding's different, and the support's different. And what was once, like a program with making Chalira, and people are all concerned about well, I don't draw attention to it, but to, use of axes and things like that. We'd never have seen any government funding at all. And now we're getting government funding and recognition. And really it's the Aboriginal people on the ground who are doing that and working absolutely fundamentally the Aboriginal way. And I've taken a back seat. And now, Kenny, you might want to speak.
Yeah, with the research that was done for Cassie, it allowed for men to actually really have a voice, to actually say, hey, look, our men's shed needs to look like this. It's not like the mainstream men's shed where you've got sort of cutting saws and band saws and the welder and all that kind of things where you need safety boots to actually enter it. And so where the men said, no, we need to better sort of do shields, we need to better make spears and all of that as part of our sort of kind of recovery and refocusing, grounding. So, and then sort of, so we don't want to be talking about this again in another 20 years. So it allowed for people to get on the front seat, on the driver's seat and drive some of these issues. So in doing that, it allowed for a real sense of autonomy. Having real sense of autonomy, you're able to bring it to sort of what is the best we can get out of both of these worlds, right? Not about pointing the fingers, it's about bringing it to make it happen. That makes me happy as well, and then makes you happy. So we're able to do it together. So this is where like the Northern Territory just come out of 15 years of intervention as well. But that 15 years is a little bit of a silver lining for us to be able to see that what does the next 15 years look like for us? Because we've got now a number attached to it. Because otherwise our life and thinking is circular. Right? This time we're able to see a linear line. We've just gone through 15 years and we can ask ourselves that question. What did I do? Did I fight it? Did I resist it? Or did I learn how to be income managed? Or did I learn how to budget? Did someone teach me how to budget? All of those core sort of kind of policy ideas. Not one was taught, really. So this is where we've got to ask the question. If we're going to design the sort of kind of legislation, then we've got to teach the legislation to the people to better absorb it. Otherwise, not one family member that's been income managed would know how to budget. And yet that was the core principle. We're going to income manage you because you don't know how to use your money properly. But it didn't teach you how to use it. Yeah, the simple human nature has to come into this. Fine, write the laws, but then teach it from a human perspective and bring the heart into it. That's what's missing, the heart. We need that to go forward collectively because we're all sort of looking for this answer too. It's not just one-sided. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I was reminded that Kenny actually did some interviews with the men, and we developed a violence program together, which Kenny led. And I just want to comment on a couple of things. That one, that violence program were for mandated adult offenders, and a lot of them were repeat offenders, and they had never been offered a program before. And Kenny was able to lead it in a cultural way. At the end of the research, Kenny did these really profound interviews with the men, and of course most of them were conducted in language, and Kenny was able to do these interviews in private, and there were a couple of really remarkable voices from the men, and one of them was that, we are perpetrators, but we've also been witnesses and victims to violence, and that we are seen as only perpetrators, but we've got bleeding hearts. And there were some very, very powerful interviews done, which Kenny conducted. And so I want to emphasize there that was also because of language and because of relationships and his capacity to bring the men together. And I think the men did feel very autonomous in that work, as one example, and that was a sort of more formalized research program than some of the programs we've been running. So yeah.
And so in that sort of process as well, it allowed for self-reflection, that in regards to, look, I'm here today as a product of violence. You know, 1928, the Coniston Massacre took place. My nana fled west and was captured by my grandfather, who raped her. And then here I am. It's as simple as that. There wasn't love in it. We're the product of this kind of behavior that happened time and time again across this country. And we're the product of it. So why are we sort of trying to restrict ourselves then? We should just liberate ourselves in regards to doing the right thing to go forward. After all, when we work together, we can achieve a good outcome. And I think that's what we're here to do, is look at what is possible in going forward.
Well, I was thinking as you were saying that, I remember going with you to one of the men's sheds, and one of the other aspects of what was important there was the telling of stories and the connection. You just brought it to mind as you said that, and it links with this coming good story, that it's this ability to reflect on where you've come from and be able to digest that, that enables you to see where you're going forward, and those men's sheds really do provide a venue for that to happen.
And an opportunity to discuss it. Well, you know, we could dwell on our problem stories, but you know, the sparkling moment is, what is our preferred story? That's what we can go to, our preferred story, and we all have them.
So just to come back to your question, Melinda, as well, I mean, I'd like to just add, and interested in your perspective, Pamela, and Ken too. I think it's got something to do with it being a psychoanalytic organisation, actually. So I am speaking a bit in favour of psychoanalysis here. And I think it does come back to the title of this conference, because it is about psychoanalytic listening. It is about the grassroots upward approach to implementing programs, you know, to sitting alongside and listening, not being in the position of knowing and telling. But it's also the psychoanalytic perspective of understanding that structures, committees, consultations, they need to be set up in a way that's containing of all the difficult feelings and tensions that emerge if you're trying to work, you know, in a sort of bicultural partnership. I don't know if you want to comment.
Yeah, I left that out. It's been absolutely major for me. And I wanted to say that that Cassie's had fantastic support from the psychoanalytic community over the years. And I don't think that I, for one, would be there, still there today, or without that support, or without my psychoanalytic, you know, supervision, which I've had from some people in the room, and books, and you know, things that have, you know, really been for me really helpful. So yeah, I absolutely endorse what Tim had to say. Indebted to psychoanalysis.
And what's your thinking about the psychoanalytic approach?
Look, I think my session after lunch would sort of kind of encapsulate a lot of these things. So I'll be able to pull it together as well. So, because this sort of kind of leads into some of my presentation. So if I could leave it to later, that'd be fantastic.
You've whetted our appetite. Okay, are there any other sort of reflections or questions? Rob Gordon.
Rob Gordon, psychoanalytic psychotherapist. Pam, I noticed as you described your conversations with these young people, you know, I was sort of thinking about, because I work with adolescents too, for different in this environment, but I was sort of going along with you and thinking, what would I do? What would I say? And so often you said something surprising that just served to kind of disrupt what was happening so that something else could happen, so that they would start listening, for instance. And it struck me that this is such an important sort of psychoanalytic act, isn't it, to actually say something that disrupts the kind of common sense fabric of our conscious mind and allow something new to be expressed. And it strikes me that it's very hard to do that because we get sucked into the everyday level of conversation. And I think that I just found it so helpful to kind of understand that what you said that was surprising comes out of, to pick up the point, all of the listening that you've done, that it somehow sits in you and you think of something quite different to say than would flow from the normal logic of the conversation, if you like. And it strikes me that that's somehow part of an indigenous cultural way of working. So I found it very helpful. I'd like to thank you for that.
Thanks for underlining that. Such an important point. Did you want to comment on that? Yeah, the point makes itself, doesn't it, in a way? Yeah. I suppose it made me just reflect too on your comment about Ogden's latest theoretical developments about the distinction between the epistemological approach, so-called, of sort of knowing and interpreting versus the ontological of allowing things to sort of intersubjectively emerge. And I think he says that the two actually never exist in pure form. They work together. But I think what your presentation showed us was that probably a bit more of the ontological, particularly when it's not individual work, is really very relevant. And I'm just interested in your thought on this, that it would also need to be a bit of a modification, really, which I think is what Rob was saying, what you demonstrated, a bit of a modification to the epistemological approach as well, not the standard one.
Yeah, I think that they're both useful, actually, but I found Ogden's work particularly useful more recently in terms of, the negative not got reality, in terms of understanding youth crime and also in ways of working. But I also think, picking up from Rob's point, that I think for some of the youth that they also have been sort of surprised that you are listening to what might be the deepest story, and not that you've been a bad youth or you're delinquent or you're mindless or, all the things that they're used to hearing. And of course, not from everybody, but I think that the youth can resonate with that. And, we have found, like with in vivo incidents and things, that they can be surprised and really settles. And then, so I think that both approaches, some of the knowing is useful, but also I think Ogden's work on the sort of ontological is very useful and relevant to the work that Cassie does. Yeah.
It's the antithesis to the magistrate's response,
Yes.
isn't it? And I had a further reflection that cutting through to create that surprise and the opening is like a positive trauma, isn't it? If you imagine a trauma is a disruptive injury, this is, I don't know, we don't have the idea of a good trauma, but I think there are good traumas. There are disruptions that allow a freeing and opening. I think it was very interesting. Thank you.
Well, we've just got a couple of minutes left. If there are any other question over here.
Thank you. Thank you, Pam, for your wonderful.
Could you just say, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm Jenny Randalls, and I'm a psychiatrist and psychotherapist. And I wanted to thank you for your talk, which I found deeply touching, also the discussion that followed. And I just wanted to say how very touched I was by your opening vignette about the hungry boy, the hand reaching out and grabbing the bread, and my reflections on the overall theme of not just feeding, passive feeding, but trying to stimulate an appetite and looking for ways to garner interest, and the physical food and the psychological food, the storytelling, the men's shed, the culture, and just how incredibly important that is, rather than doing it for them, you know, providing food, encouraging them to search and become curious. It was deeply moving, and thank you.
Did you want to comment?
Yeah, thank you.
Kind of question here.
Juliana Pripich from here in Melbourne. Amongst other things, I'm a Jungian analyst and have spent time in Alice. One of the things I just want to bring into here that I'm aware of through my own work and engagement in this space is this focus on them in Alice are far away, and it's a problem. You know, we can talk about it and dissect it and diagnose it. But in Melbourne, we don't need to worry about such things, or in Sydney, we don't need to worry about such things. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we are all on Indigenous country, and the trauma doesn't just belong in Alice or in remote communities. And I'm just filled with tears as I say that. They belong everywhere. And, you know, if I think about that sort of shift from when white man first came to Australia to seeing the Aboriginal person as the abject, the alien, the other that doesn't exist, moving through to the Aboriginal being the savage, and then the Aboriginal being the enemy that needs to be destroyed. And then we've gone through, if I think about the government's closing the gap strategies, we're here to help you. We're now the Aboriginal is the indigent, and we will help you. And there's now this shift about, well, the Aboriginal is now the ally. They're just all like us, really. But in that final one, there's still not an acknowledgement of, or an understanding of what Aboriginal culture is really all about. And what does it mean to work in that intercultural space wherever we are in this country?
Thank you very much for that. I think this session was particularly focused on Central Australia, and we're bringing sort of material from that. So that's probably why it sounded a bit like that. But I think it's fair to say that we're all highly cognizant, you know, that it exists everywhere. But I thank you for drawing our attention to that. But we have to be mindful that it's everywhere, and it's, you know, it's everyone's responsibility to look at that. I think we're probably going to have to draw the session to a close. I think it's been an incredibly moving and special session that we've heard. Thanks in large part to Pamela, but once again for your elaborations, Ken, and it's all the time modelling, working together, and this importance of listening, and in particular psychoanalytic listening. Thank you to everyone for all your questions and comments, thoughtful contributions. We'll now have lunch until 2 o'clock. And then we've got a very interesting panel coming up at that point. So look forward to seeing you back. But for now, just let's finally thank our presenter.